you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to deal with two issues in my speech. First, on the issue of choice and spirituality. Second, on the issue of how this leads to better religious practice. But before that, several points of rebuttal. So first of all, what we heard from the previous speaker was to say that the government should only intervene in religious practices only when that religious practices cause harm to other individual that doesn't practice that religious practices. Now, first of all, she has conceded that the right to free religion is not absolute, and there is a line that can be drawn. I'm going to explain that later in my argumentation. But second of all, the problem here is that it is extremely difficult to make a distinction between harm to self and harm to other, especially in the context of a very close, hierarchical religious organization. My partner gave you many analyses in how peer pressure work, how the fear of ostracization, how the fear of being labeled as sacrilegious pressure these individuals to participate in this particular activity. So it's very difficult to make that distinction of how whether these individuals are purely making that decision on the interest of themselves, or if their choice is actually affecting other individuals to also be pressured to make that particular practice. And when that distinction is extremely difficult to make, we believe that we should err on the side of caution and prioritize protecting these individuals from inflicting self-harm. Second of all, she responded to my partner's argumentation by saying we're only dealing with minority extreme case religion. We're not just, then they're talking about a more moderate self-harm. Now we think that practices such as stigmata, practices such as self-immolation by many Buddhist sects is extremely harmful, and unfortunately is practiced by many Buddhist sects around the world. So we don't think that this is a minority case. We do believe that this is a case that we need to tackle. But moreover, the very precise reason that these individuals practice these activities, they want to show their piousness over other individuals, so to enter the heaven. So there's obviously a competition of piousness, and we think that these practices often lead to more radicalization, of being more harmful to those individuals. But the third response is, not yet, they said that if religion, even if we take this policy, these religion, if they are already radical and extreme, they won't change and will find another way to radicalize to show their piousness. Now, number one, we're more than happy to ban those radical practices as well. But second of all, oftentimes it is not monetary reason or self-interested reason of these elderly religious leaders that the reason why they force these practices upon their fellow believers. It is simply for the very fact that these practices have been practiced for centuries and centuries, and these elderly simply respect the very history that these practices have been practiced. So there's no logical backing or logical reasoning why these practices are meaningful. The only reason that these elderly meaningfully impose these practices is because they don't want to be the one to be the reformist and maybe labeled and criticized by other fellow believers. So moving to the first issue, not yet, choice and spirituality. Now, what we heard from the negative team was that being able to practice these activities is extremely important for these individual spirituality. Now, number one, oftentimes these practices are not the core part of these religion, and it is a superficial practices that is oftentimes created centuries after the religion initially started. So for example, stigmata, which is a practice where these believers intentionally harm themselves, mimicking the suffering of Jesus Christ, these practices didn't start until the Renaissance age, centuries after the birth of the Christian religion, which was imposed by a particular Catholic priest. So you still can be a good and happy and pious Christian believer without practicing these kind of activities. But second of all, even if it is a part of their core belief, we believe the right to free religion is not absolute. And that is why, for example, government regulates on things such as cult religion. We don't allow religions to provide their believer with things such as intoxicating drugs, right? Psychedelic drugs, which is exactly what happened in cults such as Omo Shinrikyo and other cult religion. Now they mentioned that this is ultimately an individual choice. Again, individual self-harm is also not an absolute right that individuals have. We think that when a harm is severe, when the harm is things such as an irreversible physical or psychological harm, such as self-immolation, such as extreme fasting, we think that the government should step in, should be paternalistic, and not allow these individuals to undergo this kind of severe harm. And that is the analogy given by my previous speaker exemplifies that. But it's not just about individual harm in today's motion. This motion occurs in the context of an organized religion. An organized religion, a hierarchical structure where peer pressure exists, where self-indoctrination from a very young age exists, where the fear of ostracization and being labeled as sacrilegion exists. So an analogy that I would put here is labor law. For example, even if you want to show your loyalty to your company, even if you want to get more money from your company, we don't allow individuals to consent to a labor standard that is extremely harmful to those individuals. We think that, yes, companies and religions are different in many ways, but we believe that the limitation of individual choice can be analogously applied here. So moving to my third issue, which is how religious practice can be changed. But before that, any point of information?
Right, so all the problem you're talking about is not about the harm, but it's about the coercion of the religious organization itself, which is going to trap those individuals for the rest of their lives. Then why not just ban religion itself?
No, you're wrong. We are against harming individual self, and we think that harm to individual self is particularly pernicious in the context of peer pressure and organized structure. So moving to my third point, which is religious practice and how we can change that. And number one, we accept that even after we take this policy, believers would still have a strong desire to express their piousness and explore their spirituality. So as a consequence of that, in alternatives, these believers would explore methods such as deeper contemplation of their religious dogmas and beliefs, theocratic discourse and discussion within their own religious community. This is way better than the status quo, where a Christian practiced stigmata simply to mimic the suffering of Jesus and only have a very superficial, not in-depth understanding of their own religious text. But moreover, these religions can resort to things such as investing more of their time and money and effort and research on things such as community working or voluntary activity to spread the word of God. We think that is a more positive and better activity that these religions can undergo. Second of all, we think that government policy or regulation can have a positive impact on religious culture. Even within the more radical religious church, believers are not uniform supporter of these practices. They are more moderate priests and imam who believe that these practices need to change and adopt a contemporary norm. They are believers who are practicing these practices reluctantly because of peer pressure and fear of ostracization. These voices are currently being shut down by oppressive hierarchical structure. We think that government policy can change the political dynamic within the church by, firstly, they will have more legal political justification to push for a reform, but secondly, they can now seek help from police authority purely by the fact that these practices are being taken place. That mechanism does not exist in the status quo, and the police are too afraid to intervene in religions because the police themselves will be prosecuted of intervening in religion. That is exactly why we are extremely critical.